Many have seen and heard about Antifa organizing during protest movements, but what I found about today is shocking. More than 20 people from around the country faced domestic terrorism charges Monday after dozens in black masks attacked the site of a police training center under construction in a wooded area outside Atlanta, where one protester was killed in January. Antifa, for short, anti-fascist, is a political movement that opposes far-right and white supremacist ideologies and groups. While Antifa has gained attention in recent years, its origins can be traced back to the early 20th century Europe. In the 1920s and 1930s, fascist and Nazi movements were on the rise in Europe, and many left-wing groups formed to oppose them. The first known use of the term anti-fascist was by the Communist Party of Germany in 1932. Anti-fascist groups in Germany, such as the Antifaschistische Aktion, were known for their direct action tactics, including street fights with Nazi supporters. During World War II, anti-fascist resistance groups played a crucial role in the fight against Nazi occupation in Europe. After the war, anti-fascist movements continued to exist in various forms, but they were often suppressed by authorities. In the United States, Antifa has been active since at least the 1980s. Antifa activists have been involved in direct action tactics such as street protests, counter-demonstrations, and property damage against far-right and white supremacist groups. In recent years, Antifa has gained more attention due to its involvement in protests against police brutality and white nationalism. Some have criticized Antifa for using violent tactics, while others argue that Antifa's actions are necessary to combat the rise of fascism and hate groups. It's important to note that Antifa is a decentralized movement, and there is no central leadership or organization. Instead, it's made up of various groups and individuals who share a common goal of opposing fascism and white supremacy. In Europe during the 1920s and 1930s, anti-fascist groups engaged in street fights with Nazi supporters, and these confrontations often turned violent. Similarly, Antifa activists in the United States have been involved in confrontations with far-right groups, such as the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. Antifa activists were among those who clashed with white supremacists during the rally, and there were incidents of violence on both sides. Some critics argue that Antifa's use of violence is counterproductive and undermines their message. They argue that it gives far-right groups an excuse to paint Antifa as violent extremists and distract from the issues they are trying to raise awareness about. Others argue that Antifa's use of violence is a necessary means of opposing fascism and hate groups. They argue that peaceful protests and counter-demonstrations are often not effective in countering the far-right's message, and that direct action is necessary to prevent these groups from gaining power and spreading their ideology. It's important to note that not all Antifa activists engage in violent tactics, and many members of the movement advocate for nonviolent resistance. However, the use of violence by some Antifa activists has been a controversial issue, and there is ongoing debate about the effectiveness and appropriateness of using violence as a means of opposing hate groups. Antifa is not a centralized organization and does not have a hierarchical leadership structure or a clear set of formalized goals or objectives. This makes it difficult to classify Antifa as a terrorist group in the same way that formal organizations such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda are classified. The United States does not have a specific federal law that designates domestic organizations as terrorist groups. While some politicians have called for Antifa to be designated as a terrorist organization, such a designation would likely face significant legal challenges due to the decentralized nature of the movement and the potential for First Amendment violations. It is important to note that political and ideological labeling can be complex and often controversial, and it is important to approach such discussions with an open mind and willingness to consider different perspectives. Nonviolent protest is a powerful tool for bringing about lasting positive change in society. History has shown that violent methods of protest, while often generating immediate attention, do not result in lasting solutions. In contrast, nonviolent protests have a proven track record of creating change that endures. One reason for this is that nonviolent protests have the ability to win over the hearts and minds of the general public. When protests are peaceful, people are more likely to listen to the message being conveyed. They are also less likely to feel threatened or fearful, which can lead to greater sympathy and support for the cause. In contrast, violent protests often create a sense of fear and insecurity, which can turn people against the protesters and the movement they represent. You can take the example of Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, early on in the Vietnam War, you had special operations units that were telling the brass at home to stop bombing villages. Enlisted soldiers were killing innocents, the operators were begging them not to, and they were begging the brass to stop coordinating bombing runs on villages for the specific reason of creating future combatants.